Hello, this is Deborah Haddon. My maiden name is Gibby, and I am the great-granddaughter of Ruth Victoria Sorenson Stringfellow. When I was 18 years old, I went to live with my grandparents, Darrell and Maxine Stringfellow. Grandpa Darrell was the son of Ruth Stringfellow, and while I was living with them, she was a patient in a nursing home in Orem, Utah. To keep herself occupied, she wrote her personal history entitled The Story of My Life, and that was written in September and October 1984, and my grandpa typed it from the handwritten notes that she had written, and I have a copy of that. So I'm recording it in a podcast form, and it begins, The Story of My Life, Ruth Victoria Sorenson Stringfellow. This may be about 45 minutes of reading. We'll just have to see. I might have to do this in multiple parts, but we'll just start now and see what happens. I was born to Peter P. and Martina C. Sorenson, June 15, 1895, the eighth child in a family of 10. The family included 2 older sisters, Mary and Linda, 5 older brothers, Orson Peter, Lawrence William, Arno Woodruff, Parley Reuben, Joseph Lawrence, a younger sister, Violet Eliza, and younger brother, Moroni. I can't remember much of my early childhood, but the story is often told about when I was about 6 years old. My brother Woodruff told me to, quote, run where the rocks are so violet. Let me try that again. Quote, to run where the rocks are so violet can't catch you. Okay. To run where the rocks are so violent can't catch you. She was always barefoot, and I always wore shoes. My early playmates were Elman Mickelson and Theo Stocking. We built castles in the sand that was plentiful where we lived. At the age of 6, I was enrolled in the Draper Park School. My first teacher was Miss Boberg. My other teachers were a Mrs. Purdy, Chris Hendrickson, Mrs. Hyginson, Charles Quinn, and Mr. Lillywhite. I loved going to school, and I got promoted every year. When I was in the 7th grade, I was on the girls' basketball team. As I remember, the team consisted of Bess Ellis at center, Agnes Fitzgerald and Edna Hayes as guards, Ivy Vaudry and I were forwards, and Valletta Smith and Lily Thompson were substitute guards. We did not wear gym suits like they do now. We wore bloomer-type suits, as we had to play our games in the schoolyard. We went to the neighboring towns to compete with them. We won a trophy and had our picture taken. Marvin, which is her husband and my great-grandpa, was on the boys' team, but he had to work on his uncle's ranch that day and did not get his picture taken with his team. We had a banquet in the hall at school and a dance the day we graduated from the 8th grade. The next day I had my picture taken with my diploma. I had a beautiful dress with rows of lace and embroidery. I wore long, white silk gloves with it. It was time to go to Junior Jordan High School, which was in Sandy. We rode to school in a long wagon with rolled-down canvas sides and pulled by a team of horses. Ryle Allen was the driver. He remained in Sandy and played pool until school was out, and it was time to take us home. Later on, the train schedule was such that we could ride to school in the morning and back to Draper in the evening. Sometimes we did not wait for the train, and we would walk along the track home. He passed the principal's tomato patch and stole some juice. We passed the principal's tomatoes patch and stole some juicy ripe tomatoes to eat. At Jordan High School, I took English, algebra, sewing, and cooking. We made cookies, cakes, candy, and mincemeat, which the teacher sold to people. The mincemeat was really delicious, and we were allowed to buy a bottle to take home. I loved to sew and accomplished quite a bit. My teacher even asked me to sew some braid on a dress that she was making. I loved English too and got mostly A's and B's in that subject. It was at Jordan High that I became acquainted with Harold Despain, and he asked me to go with him to Salt Air. We had a very good time, and we dated real often that summer. He was a very good guy, and he was from Granite. His folks moved to Arizona, and he had to go too. Marvin was in the sheep business with his brothers Earl, George, and Eldon. They built a home in Draper for their mother. It was about 2 blocks from my home. When he was out on the range with the sheep, we corresponded as best we could. When he got to come home, he would come to see me. He liked to go to Salt Lake to sheep conventions. and when he did, he always came home with a box of chocolates for me. He was also very thoughtful of his sisters Inez and Clara and brought presents for them. Electricity finally came to Draper, and then things got easier for us as we had lights installed in all the rooms. They worked with sort of a pulley chain on it. We kept our food cool in an ice box, as it was a long time until refrigerators were available. I was married to Marvin before my brothers Rube, Joe, and Woodruff got married. It was when Dorothy was a baby that we had to move to Magna. Orson already lived there, and Woodruff moved there too, for there was no work in Draper except farming. They all worked at the Magna mill. Rube and Joe came to stay with us, then Rube was called into the army. In World War I, he served in France and was wounded there and sent back to the United States. He never wanted to talk about his days in the service. Elman Mickelson was also there, and they became and remained staunch friends. Rube married Ivy Dancy, and Elman married Nora Hendrickson. We were neighbors to L. Ray Christensen and his family. L. Ray taught music and English at Draper Junior High School. He served as a mission president in Texas and president of the Logan Temple before becoming a general authority of the LDS Church. His last position was assistant to the 12. Bert Andrus and his wife, Mary Mickelson Andrus, also lived close. They had 3 children, Irva, Belva, and a little boy. The little boy was drowned in a boiler of soap suds that was put by the side of the house. There was a stream of water that ran behind their house, and they were always fearful that he would drown in that. Joe and Ariellis Mickelson ran a feed plant for the many people that were in the chicken business in Draper at this time. Marvin worked for them for a time, then later he and Eldon were in the business together. We ate a lot of chicken at that time. Even after electricity came, we did our ironing with 2 heavy irons heated on the stove. Sometimes they would get black, and I would rub them off on a soap wrapper. Waxed paper was not known then. I would iron early in the morning. I piled the pillowcases in a neat pile and put them on a shelf in the bathroom. Rube made me a sturdy ironing board that I used for many years. One day Val and Ann came in and saw me trying to iron some drapes. So when they came the next time, they brought me a nice new one. I love to iron the seams on the dresses that I made. If I could stand now without my walker, I would like to go home and use it now. I loved Marvin very much, and I knew that he loved me, so that with a little encouragement from me, he finally asked me to marry him. He went into Salt Lake City the next day and bought me the most beautiful diamond ring I ever saw. I am still wearing it beside the pearl friendship ring he gave me before. My ring is of 19-karat gold. We were married November 4th, 1915, in the Salt Lake Temple. We caught the train in Draper at 5:30 a.m. When we got to Salt Lake, we took a streetcar from the train to the temple. We had to wait some time, but then we went through the temple and received our endowments and were sealed together for time and eternity. It was all so wonderful, and we were very happy. We had a wedding reception that night, and all the friends were invited. And all the friends and relatives were invited. They stayed most of the night. We sneaked away to sleep in my sister's home that night. Marvin had bought the Terry home across the street from his mother's home. Before we were up in the morning, the carpenters who were to remodel our home were knocking on the door, wanting to know what he wanted done. Sometimes we stayed at his mother's home, and sometimes we stayed at my mother's. Finally, it was finished, and we needed furniture. Mother suggested that we buy a china cabinet for the beautiful hand-painted dishes we received at our wedding. Marvin and I went to the P.W. Matson Furniture Company in Salt Lake City and selected what we needed. We bought a china cabinet, a round dining table, 6 leather-seated chairs, a dresser and dressing table with a mirror and a stool. A kitchen table was already in the home. We also bought a kitchen stove and a washstand mirror, a brass bed and springs, and we bought a brass bed and springs. Marvin took a large hay wagon drawn by a team of horses to bring our furniture home. We were now more comfortable than most young couples our age. Marvin had to find a job since the money he got from selling out his share of the sheep business was gone. Since there was nothing else to do in Draper, he went to work for a sheep man by the name of Frank Fitzgerald. When the children grew and it was time for them to go to school, Dorothy was eager to go, but with Darrell we had a problem. He never wanted to go anywhere without Dorothy. I often had to threaten him with a little switch before he would go. Grandma Stringfellow wanted us to come and live with her in part of her home. She had forgotten that kids will be kids, and she didn't want them to play on her lawn. She always wanted them to pull weeds. They said if anyone could get along with her that I could, but even with me it did not work out. Before I was married, I joined a group called the Clover Club Girls. There was Bertha, Lavona, and Naomi Rasmussen, Elva McGuire, Phoebe Cottrell, and Ava Allen. We decided to put on a dance. We hired Orgill's band and advertised it in all the neighboring towns. We made quite a lot of money. We decided to spend part of it by going to Salt Lake and have dinner. The restaurant where we ate thought it was quite a group of young girls to feed. After I moved to Provo, I was invited to join a group of ladies called the Lie Guy Matrons Club. There was 11 of us, and each month 2 of us would entertain in our home. When Christmas time came, we would each pay $2, and we went to a cafe in downtown Provo. We had many good times together, as it was mostly neighbor ladies who belonged. There were Elizabeth Stein, Millie Stewart, Rose Miller, Myrtle Clark, Myrtle Clayson, Florence Billings, Val Anderson, Florence Larson, Florence Franson, Elma Hawes, and Mrs. Ted Bandley. Chapter 2. My father was a tall, handsome man with a mustache and curly hair. He had a winning personality. When church leaders would visit Draper Ward on Sundays, he would often invite them to come to our home for dinner without warning Mother. He took much pride in his family, also his horses, his cows, and orchard. My father planted a peach orchard. Everywhere there was a space he planted a peach tree. They were mostly early lemon Albertas. When the peaches got ripe, we all helped to pick them. We had more than enough for our own use, so we would place baskets of them out by the side of the road for sale. I remember William Andrus, who worked nearby, would come down to the orchard to fill up on peaches at lunchtime. He never offered to pay Mother for them or even express thanks. My father was killed in a railroad accident. He was a section foreman on the Denver and Rio Grande track. He and some of his crew were riding on a handcar when it left the track, and he was thrown off on his head and was killed instantly. It was a terrible shock to our family and to the people of Draper. I remember that I had prepared his lunch that morning. He had 2 stores in Draper, the Draper M&M and Rideout's Mercantile. Rideouts always had butter and eggs that folks would bring in to exchange for other things they needed. David Bills, who came from Riverton with covered wagon that contained many different cuts of meat. He made the trip twice a week and would stop at the front gate and ring a bell. Mother would go out to the wagon and select the cut she wanted. It was usually a soup bone with a little meat on it during the and it doesn't say anything else. And then it starts. Mr. Bills had only common wrapping paper to wrap the meat in. Another man would come along about twice a week with a wagon loaded with vegetables, and he would select those which we did not grow in our own garden. I sewed my own dresses, and I also sewed for my mother, my sister Linda, and for Mother's sister Clara. My mother bore 10 children. The only one that she had the services of a doctor was Violet, the last of the 10. Mother was a hard worker, and she always saw to it that we were kept clean and well. Her home was always clean and orderly. She taught us children how to work and keep a house in order. We had a lot of chickens. The boys would cut their heads off. Then she would scald them in very hot water to remove the feathers. The small feathers were put in a bag and hung out on the clothesline to dry. After they had dried for several days, they were made into pillows. She also had a feather bed tick to put on her bed. I still have a couple of feathered pillows on my bed here at the center. She's talking about the nursing home. Mother was a very kind person. All us children needed only to look at Mother, and then we knew she did not approve of what we were doing. I never remember ever being spanked. Nearly always we had chicken for Sunday dinner. My father would always bring Uncle Garf home from Sunday school because he thought it was too far for him to walk home and back to sacrament meeting. She cooked dinner for the stake presidency whenever they came to the Draper Ward. Her brother Jim Jensen was one of them. J.B. Jensen and his wife often drove out from Salt Lake in their big car to share Mother's chicken dinner. No one would ever go to visit her. She always had a piece of cake or jelly. Wait. Let me back up. Sorry. No one ever would go to visit her when she didn't have a piece of cake or jelly roll and a cup of coffee ready for them. She and I became very embarrassed one time when Wilson Sorenson came in and we were drinking coffee. Wilson had just returned from his mission. I never drink coffee now. Just a little side note here. I often heard them talking about Wilson Sorenson. I actually pronounced him Wilson Sorenson. in my reading because I'm reading pretty quickly, but they always pronounced it Wilson, Sorenson. Chapter 3, Dorothy, Daryl, Madeline, and Val. Dorothy was born December 12, 1916. When Dorothy was about a year old, we moved to Ragtown, which is Magna. Marvin was able to get employment there at the copper mill. There was nothing else to do in Draper, so many other families moved to Magna. We rented our home to Boyce Day and his wife Macy, and then later on we rented it to Marvin's brother Eldon and his wife Naomi. I made several trips on the train back to see Mother. One time I stayed for 2 weeks to make a wedding dress for Violet, as she was going to marry Roy Danzy. After a couple of years, we returned to our home in Draper. Just a point of interest, if any family members get on Family Search, there are very, very many pictures of the Danzy family. So if you see them on there, then you know what the connection is. Dorothy started school in the first grade at the Draper Park School. She was an excellent student and received a special promotion, finishing both the third and fourth grade in 1 year. In the ninth grade at Draper Junior High, she had a leading part with Drew Risky in the operetta Sunbonnet Sue. She attended Jordan High School, where she met and started dating Wayne Soph, who later became her husband. Wayne was a very good athlete. At Jordan High, he excelled in basketball. He was the center on the team that lost by 2 points to Granite High for the state championship. He was best known for his football days at BYU, where he became an all-conference end and later coached the freshman team and line coach for the varsity. Dorothy and Wayne were not able to have children of their own, so they adopted Stephen and Sherry. Dorothy was sort of the life of the family. She was the one that got the family together for parties and projects. Wayne passed away in his early 50s after a 10-year battle with cancer. Dorothy's last illness was somewhat similar to Wayne's, except hers started in her kidneys, one of which had to be removed. For about 3 years, she bravely battled the disease. I was 2 years old. Back to myself here, Debbie. I was 2 years old when Aunt Dorothy died, and I remember going to visit her, and maybe I was older than that. I'm sorry. I think I must have been about, it doesn't have a date here, does it? 1972, so I was about 6, okay. Because I remember having my little brother. I remember going to visit her at her house, and she was lying down on the couch, and I remember the TV was on, and I got very close to the TV, and I remember her gently and kindly saying to me not to get too close to the TV. She was afraid it was going to give me cancer, and obviously cancer was really a worry for her. And also I picked up her glass of water, and I went to go drink a glass of water that she had been drinking from, and she told me not to drink it because she was afraid that I would get sick from it. So I got a few minutes. I got a little interaction with her and learned what a nice lady she was. I also knew Sherry. I didn't know Steve very well. Her son Steve was on a mission in the eastern states, and Sherry was too young to be on her own. These seemed to be her main worries. Daryl accompanied Dorothy on many of her weekly trips to Salt Lake to the clinic and hospital. Val was with Dorothy in the hospital when she passed away April 15th, 1972. Daryl was born February 1st, 1920 in Draper. When Daryl was just beginning to walk, he came down with lobar pneumonia. He had several doctors, Dr. Jensen, Dr. Pomeroy, and Dr. Root. Dr. Root was the only one that seemed to know how to handle the little boy. He came to Draper in his horse and buggy from Salt Lake City and told us that Daryl would have to lose all his flesh before he could start to get well. Daryl ran a high temperature for 5 months and became a very skinny little baby. Everyone told us to let him go, but we had faith and we knew the Lord would bless him and he would get well. We had some ladies come in to help us, Hannah Brown, Nita Dunyan, Della Walker, and Effie Crane. Whenever Daryl was offered food, he would push it away. Grandma Stringfellow would come with a cake she had baked and put it before him. One morning after Marvin had left for his farm, I was in my bed with my little boy, and he began to smile and pick away the lint on the bedspread, and I knew right then and there he was going to get well. All this little time, Dorothy was with her Grandma Sorenson, who did most everything to amuse her. She even fed the chickens out in the yard. As Daryl grew bigger, he was his dad's shadow. Jim Rollins said Daryl looked just like Marvin. Daryl always kept busy, mostly digging holes in the yard. Once My grandpa, in his adult years, was a rock hound, so he started early. Once he rode his tricycle down the cellar steps, which was close to our kitchen door. Darrell says his first memories are of him and his dad riding out to the farm in the wagon drawn by his dad's 2 white horses named Bob and Dan, and dad singing as they traveled along. My sister Linda would often come and walk the floor with Darrell, and she would sing to him a song about a little brown donkey. On Friday the 13th of February 1931, Marvin and I were in Salt Lake shopping. Marvin suggested that we should see a movie before we went home, but I had a strong feeling that we should return home. When we got home, Darrell was not at home. We found him at his grandmother's, lying on her couch, sound asleep. He had come from school with his valentines and a bad headache. We were very worried because there had been 2 cases of spinal meningitis show up in Draper. Dr. Sorenson in Riverton was contacted by Uncle Rube and was told to have us wrap him up in a blanket and get to the LDS hospital in Salt Lake, and he would make the arrangements. Dr. Sorenson arranged for the LHO Stobie to take over, for Dr. LHO Stobe to take over. We waited in the lobby for the doctor to come and tell us that we suspected Darrell had meningitis. Darrell was unconscious for 3 days, and during that time received several spinal injections of a very new medicine discovered by the Rockefeller Foundation. The family was under quarantine, but we were able to go to the hospital and look in on Darrell through the door to his room. Dorothy took care of Madeline, and they ate lots of baked potatoes. After Darrell had been in the hospital about a week, he noticed that his left eye was blind. So he told the doctor, who called in an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist by the name of Dr. Henderson, who spent many hours trying to find out what could be done. After 3 weeks, Darrell was released from the hospital. About a week later, his eye swelled up and discolored, so we returned to Dr. Henderson, who told us that he had had an ethmoid abscess behind his eye, and to save it we must hot pack 20 minutes, then cold pack 20 minutes daily until the swelling went down. After this problem, the eye slowly shrunk until it was closed. A year or so later, we decided to have it removed in favor of an artificial eye. Finally, it was decided that the meningitis had destroyed the nerves behind the eye. As Darrell grew older, he graduated from Provo High School and Brigham Young University, after which he served in the Army at Fort Douglas in the personnel office as post headquarters for 2 years. Now in the Edgemont 4th Ward, he has served as financial clerk in 4 bishoprics. He also serves as a quality control inspector at the church cannery in Linden. Now that I'm living at a rehabilitation and health center, he and Maxine visit me several times a week and sees to it that I have everything I need. He is, indeed, a very thoughtful and wonderful son, and his wife Maxine I love like she was my own daughter. Sometimes they come to the center and get me and take me to their home for a visit. When I'm there, I see the beautiful oil paintings he has painted hanging in his living room. He and Maxine have a nice home, and I enjoy going there for a change from the dull life here at the center. Maybe his life was spared through 2 bad illnesses so that he could help care for his mother and dad in their last years. Darrell and Maxine have 3 children. Barbara is the oldest. She is married to Ray Gibby, and they have 6 children: Debbie, Teresa, Darrell, Jenny, Raymond, and Leanne. Wayne is the next and is married to Kathy Clayton. They have 2 children, John and Tricia. David is the next and is married to Denise Kendall. They have not had children yet. And I will give you an update. As the cousin of David and Denise Kendall's children, they had Whitney, Parker, in order, Whitney, Parker, and Shelby. I think that's how it goes. Whitney, Shelby, and Parker. Yeah, Whitney, Shelby, and Parker. Madeline was born on the evening of January 19th, 1925. Linda heard her cry as she passed by the house on her way home from the M&M store where she worked. Marvin just barely made it to the home in time. Hannah Brown was my nurse. Whenever she would cry, Hannah would give her paregoric. I was so angry at Hannah. I had to remain in bed for 10 days, and Eugenia Vaudry was my hired girl. But she spent most of her time across the street at the post office talking to Clara Brown. The washing froze on the clothesline. Madeline was really a pretty baby with coal black curly hair. I think of Madeline really often. She had a very beautiful voice. She sang, and our neighbor, Floyd Millett, would whistle. What a combination for a duet. I sincerely hope she still sings. I miss her very much now. Madeline graduated from Provo High School, met and married James Dean Clayton. She worked for Sears Roebuck and Company as an audit clerk, a position previously held by Dorothy and Maxine. Before she retired at the time, they moved to California. Dean was a school teacher and later school principal there. Both Madeline and Dean held positions of leadership in the church in California. They have 3 children, Gary, Susan, and Michael. As I said before, Madeline was a beautiful baby, and our neighbors, the Mickelsons, were wild about her. Soren Mickelson had some grass east of their home. He had a cow, and he wanted us to put it in his pasture. At one time, when Marvin was away, it was my job to milk it. When I got back, Dorothy was heating pork and beans on the stove. They were well done. I was surprised to get a call from Madeline's in Pomona shortly after Sue was born, so I left home in a hurry. I caught the train in Salt Lake in the evening, and Dean was at the station the next morning to meet me. Madeline had just returned from the hospital and was not quite strong enough to take care of her baby, so I took over the job as best I could. It had been quite some time since I had cared for a little baby, but I managed. When Sue cried at night, I would walk the floor with her until she would fall asleep. Gary was at the age where he was a problem and in all kinds of mischief. Dean took me for a drive a few times while Madeline and Sue slept. One day when we returned home, Gary was up to mischief again, trying to stuff a banana down the bathroom sink. Well, I enjoyed every minute of it, and it was soon time to return to Provo to see how Marvin was getting along without me. He knew how to cook a few things, so he did not starve. He tried to pass the time watching TV, but when he turned it on, it had a crack right down the middle of the picture tube, so we put in a call for a repairman. As years went by, Marvin and I went to spend Christmas with Dean and Madeline. They did everything possible to make it pleasant and interesting for us. Dean drove us to many interesting places in California. This was indeed the happiest times of our lives. We enjoyed the rides on the bus. Val was born on November 3rd, 1932 in Draper. When he was about 2.5 years old, we decided to move to Provo. Val rode his little tricycle back and forth from one corner of the block to the other. His friends were Pat Richens, Weldon Moffett, Wayne Stewart, during his preschool days. We took students for room and board, and Val became very friendly with them. He would invite them to fish with him whenever they walked into the house. I lost my place. Excuse me, I gotta find my place, sorry. Val usually had a deck of cards in his pocket, or close by in a case he would persuade someone to join him in a game. He liked to take a book or two under his arm and walk down the sidewalk to the corner like he was going to school, too. Val never did attempt to cross the street. In grade school, he had 2 special friends, Bob Westover and Brian Rasmussen. He usually got a piece of cake at the Westovers. He grew old enough to get a job at a paper carrier for the Salt Lake Tribune. Ooh. So I'm holding my camera in front of this picture of Grandma because it's most efficient to record on a camera and upload to YouTube. And I'm forgetting what I'm doing with my left hand while I'm turning pages with my right hand. So you see this moving around. That's why. Okay, I apologize. He liked to take a book or two under his arm and walk down the sidewalk to the corner like he was going to school, too. Val never did attempt to cross the street. In grade school, he had 2 special friends in Bob Westover and Brian Rasmussen. He usually got a piece of cake at the Westovers. He grew old enough to get a job as a paper carrier for the Salt Lake Tribune. Oh, there we go, I caught up. It meant getting up real early in the morning. He always paid his bill for the papers on time and became a special friend of Mr. Lindy, his boss. Val always spent his earnings wisely. He was a good student, and when he graduated from Farrer Junior High, he enrolled at Provo High School for 1 year. He was not given the opportunity he wanted to play football. The next year, he enrolled at BY High School, where he made the team under Coach Owen Dixon. He played football and baseball and was captain of the football team in his senior year. He was mentioned on many all-region selection as a fullback. When Val graduated from high school in 1950, he enrolled at BYU. Marvin was happy that he had decided to major in geology so that he could advise he and Daryl on their mining project in the West Millard County. They owned a silver mine. My great-grandpa had found silver when he was out on the range, the winter range with his sheep, and so that's what got his interest in mining. Val got experienced in Stansbury Mountains and other places where he went. He also worked for the Shell Oil Company in Nevada and Oregon while waiting to be called to active duty in the ROTC. At BYU, he took ROTC training and upon graduation became Air Force officer and pilot. He was on active duty in Texas, Florida, and California. During his time at Long Beach, he was close to Madeline and Dean, who lived in Pomona. The 4th of July, 1955 came, and, as always, there was a big parade in Provo and a stadium show with fireworks afterwards. Val was quite uneasy because Marvin and I did not want to go. After thinking a few minutes, he decided to call Ann Kitchen for a date. She accepted, and they went and dated often after that. On the 24th of July, we were all at Madeline's home for a picnic. After the picnic, Val and Ann took off by themselves. Val had a pretty Oldsmobile car and was scheduled to report to San Antonio, Texas. So they decided to get married, and Ann would go with him. On October 24th, they were married. 1955, they were married in the Salt Lake Temple, and not long afterward left for Texas. Maury Jackman, a close friend of Val's, came to our home looking for Val. I told him Val was married to Ann, and he looked very surprised. Ann returned sometime later to attend her brother Paul's wedding. Later, when we were visiting Madeline and Dean in California, they took us to Long Beach to visit Val and Ann. We stayed overnight, and Ann prepared a nice breakfast for us. Val and Ann always make friends easily, so they did not get too homesick. After serving in the Air Force, they decided to return to Utah, and Val became an aircraft traffic controller at Salt Lake City. They bought a home in Bountiful and have 4 children: Scott, who's married to Julie, Karen, who's married to Kyle McMullen, Jane, and Clark. They have 4 grandchildren at this time: David and Peter Stringfellow, and Jill and Jeff McMullen. And that family has grown over the years. I can't keep up with everybody now. Okay, Chapter 4, My Activities in Provo. I was never one to seek public attention, but when I asked to do a job, I accepted it and did the best I could. I was a visiting teacher in the Manuva ward. My parent partners were Sister Stone, Rose Matson, Rosella Collard, Jean Hoover, and Mattie Hanks. Manuva ward was only 3 blocks from my home, and as I went to it, many of my neighbors joined me, both on Sunday and on Monday morning for Relief Society. Manuva was later moved into the 9th ward and was too far away for me to walk, and I did not drive a car, so I did not attend meetings there. When I was about 50 years of age, I worked for J.C. Penney Company in Provo. I worked upstairs in all the departments at first. Clyde Crockett was the manager, and Ernest Steele was his assistant. We often had to check into the store a half an hour early, and Ernie, as we called him, would stand up in his snow-white shirt and tell us that if we knew a man had 50 cents in his pocket, we were to get it. We were given quotas to make at the end of the week, and sometimes it was very difficult to meet them. They wanted us to wear either black or navy blue. We got a